box. They went and collected for UNICEF. There it is. That's actually probably one from about the time that I went and collected UNICEF. It was a little orange box, and you would go door to door, and you'd knock on the door, and you'd say, "Can you give to UNICEF?" And then they would put a quarter in, or a dime in, or a couple dollars in. And that's the way that worked. And I always remember that a lot of people, if you got a dollar, it was like, wow, that was a big gift. Or if you got a $5, that was like amazing. We'd open them up back at school, you're like, look what I got in there. You show everybody. But I was always amazed by the people that would be like, oh, I'm so sorry I couldn't give very much, and they put a quarter in, or I'm so sorry I just don't have a lot right now, and so I can't really give what I'd like to give. And it always amazed me because I didn't think they understood what happened when we would get back to the school. Because when we got back and all the classrooms would tear open those UNICEF boxes and we'd put all that money together into one big pile, we would actually raise thousands of dollars, just a quarter or a nickel or a dime at a time. And so all that little really would end up being quite a lot. In fact, in 2011, kids going door to door raised over $400 million for UNICEF, if you can believe it. It's unbelievable to me. Maybe you know of the other charity, March of Dimes. I'm sure you've seen their little placards up on a counter at maybe a restaurant or a grocery store or a convenience store, and you'd put a little dime in a sleeve, right? You've all seen this before. Well, March of Dimes has been around since 1938, and I had this conversation the other day with somebody, and I said, I can't believe it's still March of Dimes. That just seems like such a small amount. Wouldn't, with inflation now, it be like March of quarters or March of half dollars, or March of, $10 bills or something like that, something different. I couldn't believe that just giving a dime could have any impact on the world nowadays. Sometimes also, we may see homeless people on the side of the road or people with signs that say, "We'll work for food." And we think to ourselves, maybe as we drive by or think about, if I give the guy a couple bucks, is it really going to make any difference in his life? Is a $5 bill going to really impact him in any way? And so unfortunately, sometimes we just drive by and don't give. And so the thing I want to get your head around today, and really what this message is about, is how can the little that I have to give ever change anything in this vast world we live in? For some of us in this room here today, this might be your first church experience. And you might be sitting there and you might be thinking, I don't really know how I have anything to give, or I don't even know how anything that I have to give could be ever used here in the church or in this community. And some of you, like myself included at times, who have been in a church for a long time and have been a Christian for a long time, we suffer from this as well. We feel defeated. We can feel really unsure that what we give might not have any effect in the kingdom, might not work that well. All of us from time to time may have thought these thoughts. Will 1 hour with our kids upstairs in kids' church really change their lives? Will standing at the door and greeting people with a smile and a handshake make any kind of difference? And how about this one? And I know I've thought this one. Will cleaning the bathrooms before a service really have any effect on the new guests that come to the river? So we can develop this attitude that we have, that our time we have, that our money that we have, that our effort that we have, that these things are not able to make a big difference in the world. And so what happens is when we begin to think of that, we think we can't make a big difference, and we might as well just not participate. We say to ourselves, I can't make a big change in this world, so I'm just going to step out. The little I have to offer is of little consequence, or so we may think. But the fact of the matter is that God can and will do a lot with our little. In fact, God can do more with our little if we give it to Him than we can do with a lot apart from God. That might sound really hard to swallow, but let's look at today in our reading, and you're going to see, I believe, just that. You're going to see that your little and my little and everyone else's little put together with God can do amazing and great things. God can use your little and my little and multiply that to make a huge impact on the community around us. Now, you may be thinking, also, this is another thing that people struggle with. You might be thinking, what I have, God can't use. Maybe there's something you feel that you've done, or the person that you are at your core is something that could never be combined with a holy God. And you look at yourself and go, oh yeah, everything I've got is so tainted. It's so not good. I'm not worthy. God can't use anything I have. You can't even relate to the idea that God has given you something that he can use. If you're thinking any of those thoughts, I am so glad you're here today, because God wants to use that little that you have to do great things. God will do more with the little you have than you could ever do with a lot apart from him. I have so much passion when it comes to this teaching, and this is because this message has applied to me so many times in my walk with God. 22 years ago, when I chose to start following Jesus, I was a wreck, and I was in such a wreck of a shape, and this is how I knew I was a wreck, because I didn't even realize that I was a wreck. I thought my life was all together. I thought I had it all figured out, but I was a complete and utter wreck. I remember at that time I started reading in Proverbs, and I would be reading through, and it kept talking about the wise man, and I'd be like, I don't understand how this wise man works. I'd read about the wise man, and I'd be like, well, that's not me. And then I'd read the second part of the proverb, and it would say something about the sluggard, or it would say something about the fool, or it would say something negative about some other aspect, and I would go, that's the person that I can relate to. That's the guy I feel like. I never felt like the wise person. Or then I would read the parables of Jesus, and I would read them, and I would labor over them like, I don't know what you're saying to me. I don't know what this means. And it used to so frustrate me. And I would go to other people in my first church there and say, what does this mean? I don't get it. And they would just rattle it off. And I'm like, how can you know that so easily? I don't have any understanding of what this says. I desperately wanted to do things for God, but I didn't feel that inside of me there was any way that I could. Now, as my heart grew closer and I started to have dreams and passion started to get igniting for serving God, and maybe someday that I would be led to speak before people and stuff like that, those were the dreams I had at that time. But I'll tell you what, I just knew that the words coming out of the mouth I didn't even like, and so why would anybody even be interested in listening to me? I prayed all the time to have that big vision, and God would, though, gently guide me to doing small things. I'd say, God, I need this big thing. I want to go do big things for you. And he would say, why don't you go to church and just greet people? And he would say, why don't you just help that lady? Or why don't you just work with those kids? And it would be so frustrating me at that time, because I thought I needed to do big things and needed to have big ways to work with God. But God was directing me to just use the little that I have. Serve here, help here. And all along, he was doing his work in me, taking my little that I had to give. I want you to keep this thought in the back of your mind as we go forward today. God will do more with the little you have than you could ever do with a lot apart from him. God will do more with the little you have than you can ever do with a lot apart from him. So our story today starts in 2 Kings chapter 4. And it starts by telling the story of a widow. She was married to a prophet, and that prophet died, and so now she's become a widow. And in those days, if you were a woman and your husband died, you really didn't have any way to provide for yourself. It was very different. It was a huge struggle. And she had 2 sons, and the creditors of the family came, and they wanted to take her 2 sons and enslave them to pay off the debts that her husband and her had accrued before he died. And so she was facing this horrible situations where she would have to sell her sons into slavery in order to pay off her debts. So she decides to go talk to the head prophet of the day, and he was named Elisha. And that's where we're going to start here in verse 1. 2 Kings 4:1. It said, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves. So she explains her dire situation to Elijah. Hey, I've got a creditor, and he's coming, and he wants to take my children as payment for the debt. Because her own assets is in her sons, and their enslavement will be the only way she could work out this debt. So she turned to her dead husband's boss, Elijah, to see what he can do and to see what God's counsel would be in this most testing of times. And so Elisha answers her in 2 Kings 4:2. He says, Elijah replied to her, how can I help you? Tell me, "What do you have in your house?" "Your servant," she replies so quickly, "has nothing there at all." Now, she obviously had stuff in her house, right? She lived there. Her 2 sons lived there. There were things in her house, but she responded, "I have nothing at all." Why do you think she said that? Why would she just say, "I have nothing at all"? I think the issue was not that she had nothing in her house, which we're going to find out later she most definitely did. The issue was that she did not value what she had. The things she had, she believed were of completely no value. So many times, this is how we respond to God. He cries out to us, "What do you have? What can you do? What are your talents? What are you excited about? Is there anything at all in your dreams?" And we respond to God back and say, "I don't have anything at all. There is nothing you can use here, God. I have nothing of any value." That is often because somewhere in our past, we became convinced that we were not of any value, that we had nothing of value. Maybe it was when you were growing up. Maybe it was a parent that beat you down constantly, or another relative, and reinforced the idea that you had nothing of any value. Maybe it was in a school, a teacher, or kids that might have picked on you and reinforced this idea that you had nothing of value at all. And maybe it was even in a former church where you felt that you were trying to find God and they didn't like who you were and they didn't like what you were and they beat you down and you felt you had nothing at all for the church. You felt like God couldn't use me. God doesn't want me. He doesn't care for me. And so we feel we have nothing for him because we view ourselves as nothing to him. We feel we can give nothing to God because we feel that we are nothing to God. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And so every time we dream a dream and we start to think of something to do and we see an avenue where we can serve or give or do something and we start to get a little excited inside and we go, "Oh, maybe, just maybe I could do this. Maybe that could be something." Boom. Then those voices come crushing down and say, "No, you can't. You're not a person of value. You're not somebody that means anything." And it gets crushed right there. And we think, "There's nothing of value in me." And we go away and we don't do what we want to do. And we become just like this widow and we say, "There is nothing good in my house." So Elijah asked her this question. I want to read this again. He says, "How can I help you?" In Kings 4:2. "What do you have in your house? Your servant has nothing at all." But then she pauses and she replies. She says, "Except a small jar of olive oil." And think of this as like, a tabletop jar of olive oil. Just a little jar that they would have used. They would have put on the plates and they would have sopped it up with bread or something. That's how they would have eaten it, with an unleavened bread. And so she has this little jar of olive oil. Notice how she responds. It's just a little jar. This is the other hurdle that we must work around. Even when we acknowledge that we do have something, it is often in our eyes never enough. We say to God, "There's no way I have enough to do what you want me to do. I am not smart enough. I only have a little intelligence. I am not rich enough. I only have a little money. I don't have enough time because I'm so busy with work and children," and on the list goes. And we never do anything, and we have justifier in action because just like the widow, we believe that God can't do anything with the little that we have. But I'm going to argue with you that this is the exact place that God would like us to be. I believe this is just where he wants us. We look at it and we think we have so little that nothing can be done. But when God looks at it and it's just a little, he gets so excited because he says to me, to you, "Give me that little. Just give it to me and let me show you what I can do with it." So when it's done and that little you give gets mixed with God, great things will happen. And you and everyone else will step back at that time and say, Look and see what God has done. You see, if we had everything we needed, if we were completely self-sufficient, why would we need God? Why would we need God here and now? Yet because of our American culture's strong, rugged individualism that's preached in pretty much everything we read and see that's tied to our culture,
We think we need to go it alone. We think we don't need God. We want to make sure that we can do it ourselves. And we want to make it happen apart from God. And when that happens and it fails, we get defeated and we get crushed. Wouldn't it be better that if when we are out on a limb, feeling that we have stretched as far as we can stretch and only have just a little bit more to give, that we gave that to God and he said, now watch and see what I can do with this. When God has a hold of the little you have, nothing is impossible to him and nothing is impossible in your life. So when we cry out to God, I have only got a little left, that is just where God wants us. It's in that crucible that great things can happen. Here's the important part, and I talk about this all the time. I talked about it in my last message, and it's just kind of this reoccurring theme. Jesus has this incredible upside-down view of the world. He says things like, the greatest is the least, weakness is power, the first it will be the last, on and on he goes. And this area is no different. If we could learn to see that the little we have, the way God sees it, if we could move from viewing little as not having enough, but viewing little as having enough so God could do his work, we would then have this expectancy so that when we give him our little, we would say, okay, God, I'm ready. You show me what you're going to do with this little I have, and I'm just going to sit back here and watch you do it. That's the place we need to be. We need not to focus on our little, but on a God that is big. We need not to focus on our little, but on a God that is big. Let's move forward to verse 3, 2 Kings 4:3. Elijah says, now go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Now there are two principles at work in this verse. First, he directs the widow to go and ask the neighbors for jars. When we have a little, we tend to need to turn to those around us for help. Again, this is very counter to our culture. You know, God could have helped the widow alone. He could have just snapped his fingers and thousands of jars could have showed up, right? I mean, there's no reason he couldn't have done it. But he didn't. He asked her to go to her neighbors and ask them for jars. When you're running thin and you are desperately begging God to get you through, more often than not, he will have someone in your midst that can help. But here's the key, you need to ask. You need to ask. By asking, you are letting yourself and everyone around you know that you have just a little left and you need help. I don't want to divert too much here right now, but I've got to because I just enjoy this so much. Does anybody here watch SpongeBob SquarePants or has watched it? Raise your hand. Give me a hand. All right, so almost 5% of you. That's great. All right, who in here knows about a character on there, recurring character called Old Man Jenkins? Nobody. Wow. Okay. Well, I know Arvid does back there. His arms up. So, because he had kids in his family that are that age too. Old Man Jenkins is a reoccurring character, and he's a crotchety old man. And over and over again, horrible things happen to Old Man Jenkins. He gets left outside during the hurricane. He falls over a cliff and gets destroyed. He gets swallowed by a seahorse. All kinds of horrible things happen. And every time when the characters come back and find Old Man Jenkins and they ask him why he didn't ask for help, he always says the same thing. And I'm going to do my best Old Man Jenkins here right now. I don't want to be a burden. You know, that's what he says every single time. I don't want to be a burden. He just never wanted to be a burden. And that's where we don't ask people for help because we don't want to be a burden on everybody. All right, I always lose my place when I go to that spot. Okay, I don't want to be a burden, so we never ask for help. But only the answers to our problems can be found, and the one that God has, that God answers to our problems, can only be found in the people that he has put around us in our life. He uses our problems to build his community. Think on that for a second. He uses our problems to build his community. The second principle here is found in where Elisha says, don't ask for just a few. Don't do this halfway, Elijah warns her. When God asks for our little and we give it to him, be prepared for something big. On both sides of this, I can relate to this. I used to have a restaurant, and on a Friday night or a Saturday, we would just be prepping like crazy, filling the coolers, filling the make table, working like dogs. Everybody, all the staff is on, and we're going and going and going and going, and we get everything full up. 4 o'clock comes, they bring in all the staff, and we're ready to go. And then no customers come. 5 o'clock comes, no customers come. And then the backbiting starts. Boy, we did a lot of work for nothing. Oh, and then the tipped employees are complaining because they're not going to be able to pay their bills because they're not making any money. And then all of a sudden, at 6 o'clock, the floodgates open and the phone's ringing off the hook for 3 or 4 hours straight. And at the end of the night, the cabinets are empty, the coolers are empty, and all that preparation, all that work we did paid off. And we were so happy at the end of that time. And that's how it works with God. If you're truly getting ready for God to do something, you'll know it because you'll be prepared for something big. And some of the people around you will be looking and maybe scratching their heads and thinking, you've gone too far. But you never really can with God. Be prepared for what God will do is a necessity for having Him do great things in your life. If you're like me, little jingles really get stuck in your head. And so I never leave one out. They always get stuck there. And so I want to say this little jingle to you, and I want you to remember it. When you obey, never do it halfway. It's a great charismatic one, by the way. Say it with me now. Ready? When I obey, I never do it halfway. There you go. We must be prepared for the fullness of God to show up, and He will. Look at this church. We had this crazy, over-engineered church. We had all these processes and things going on, and we had 70 to 80 people coming, and we were happy with that. We were content if that was all that ever would. We'd just be crazily over-engineered and do a lot of work for 70, 80 people. But then something happened about 1.5 years ago, and God opened the floodgates, and whoosh, we went from 70, 80 to some weekends now we're 3 times that amount. And so it seemed so pointless at the time when we were doing all that stuff to people on the outside, but in the end, we were preparing for what God was bringing to us, and it got us to where we are today as a church. The problem we can run into is that we see the little we have, and we only go halfway. We have problems that confront us, and we feel so stressed, so stretched, and we look at the little we have left, and we sell God short by only going halfway. And when we only go halfway, we fail. And who do we blame when we fail? We blame God sometimes, don't we? We say, God, we turn to Him and say, you told me to do this and it didn't work out right. Or I went and followed you here and now I'm lost. You're the fault that this is the mess I'm in. But God is not the author of that defeat when you only go halfway. So look at your lives right now. Where has He asked you to give a little and you are just going halfway? If you want the fullness of God in your life, find a way to give Him what you have been holding back on. Let's look at verses 4 and 5 of 2 Kings chapter 4. So he says, then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side. She left him, she shut the door behind her and her sons, and they brought the jars to her, and she kept pouring. She kept pouring. So the widow did as Elijah asked her to do, and she closed the door, and she began to pour one jar after another. As one jar would fill, we'd bring her another one. Think about that image there. She's got these big jars, and she's got this little tiny table carafe, and she's filling one giant jar after another with this little tiny carafe. How amazing that must have been to be there. And this is such a foundational principle with our walk with Jesus. He takes our little and He multiplies it. We could go to Him and say, Lord, this is all I have, but what could you do with it? And He takes it and He turns it into a huge harvest. In the book of Luke, it says, Luke 16:10, whoever can be trusted with a very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. By this verse, we see that when we are trustworthy with a little, then and only then will God give us a lot. We often approach this in the completely opposite way. We say to God, God, give me a lot so I can do great things for you. But God says, let's see first how you can handle the little, and then we'll go from there. God is going to watch how you handle the little, because that will demonstrate how you handle having more. If you can handle the little, if you can't handle the little, rarely is God going to give you more to handle, because you're not handling it properly. You may keep on crying out, God, I need more. I need more money. I need more faith. I need more time. I need more of everything. But God is waiting to see how you handle the little first before he gives you more. The widow was obedient. She followed his instructions to the fullest. With the little that she had, her little was given, and it grew to fill so many jars. Let's look at verse 6, 2 Kings 4:6. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, there is not a jar left. Then the oil stopped flowing. God will only give you what you can handle or what you are prepared for. When the jars ran out, so did the oil. Think about that. She's pouring. She asked for another jar, and whoop, that's it. There was no more. God will only give you what you can handle or what you are prepared for. Like I was talking before, we had this explosive growth here at the river. But then after that, we found out that some of our processes and some of our ministries were not really up to the task of handling so much that was happening. And so now we're in this new cycle. We're revamping some ministries. We're creating new processes, and we are getting ready for the next wave that we know God will bring us. Paul said that so neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. So it isn't our job to make it grow. That's fully on God. When you're giving him your little, don't worry about the lot that's going to happen. That's God's. We water, we plant, and then we wait on him to multiply it. Doesn't that just take a huge burden off of you? Doesn't that, for you, those who are in ministry, doesn't that just give you a fresh breath? Like, all I got to do is water and plant. I got to fill the jars, and God will make it grow. The widow never worried about how much oil was in that little carafe. She just worried about pouring and getting the next jar. When we prepare, God has the ability to provide. When we prepare, God has the ability to provide. Let's finish in 2 Kings 4:7. She went and told the man of God, and he said, go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left. So she goes to Elijah and tells him what happened. And he says, you know what? Go and sell the oil. Pay off your debts, and you'll have so much money left over that you and your family, you'll be taken care of for the rest of your life. Your debts will be paid. She was given so much abundance because she was willing to give a little and be obedient with it. So our last principle here we see is God can use your little to change reality. God can use your little to change reality. Her sons were destined to a life of slavery, and in that life, they would have forever wondered, where was God? My father served God diligently. He was a prophet. And God, where was he? And now we're sold into slavery, and we have a life of slavery. And they would have been bitter and resentful to God because where was he, right? They were sold into slavery for a debt that wasn't even theirs. But because the widow was obedient and the widow gave her little, that narrative was completely different. Instead of that narrative, the narrative is going to be that her and her two sons and the people around her were going to go and tell everybody they knew, look what God has done. Look at this miracle. We were destitute. I was just about to sell my sons in slavery, and God performed a miracle. And now we have enough to pay all our bills, and we have enough to live for the rest of life. And they will tell everyone they meet till the day they die of the great miracle that God had done for them. You may be thinking that that's maybe just a great old Bible story, and things don't really happen like that today. The band would come up now. The founder of March of Dimes knew the power of people giving a little. He believed that if everyone just gave a little, just one thin dime, then the world could be changed. He started the March of Dimes to bring about an end to polio. Polio was a horrible, horrible viral infection that racked thousands and thousands of children every year and turned them into cripples. It was a horrible, horrible, horrible situation. But people gave a dime here and a dime there. Not much, just a little. And by 1955, the March of Dimes had raised $233 million, one dime at a time. Think about that. It was during the Depression, during the war years. People did not have much to give. Maybe a dime was a huge sacrifice for them. But in 1955, with the approval of the Salk vaccine, and much of that funded through the March of Dimes, polio was eradicated from most of the face of the earth. And by giving a little, the painful reality for millions of children was changed forever. Don't ever doubt that that little you have to give will not be turned into amazing things. Do you have just a little money to give? Give it. Do you have just a little time to give? Give it. Do you have just a little effort, a little more effort to give? Give it. Do you see a place to serve? Just a little. Serve. Give what you have and mix it with what everyone else is giving. And together, as we give that to God, we will change this church. We'll change this community. Together with God, even the county or the state, we could even change this country and ultimately the world, so that all will know that we'll have a chance, all could know to have a chance to know Him. And I'm going to tell you right now, if you think that's hogwash, if you think that's just too big thinking, if you think your little will never be like this little that the widow had, then you do not understand the God you serve. You do not understand Him. Don't ever discount what you have to give. God has placed it there for you to give to Him. Thank you.